Dr. Dungy. I'm very happy to talk to you in this series of NEC Fellows interviews. You've been here for a year,
yes.
Academic year. Could you tell us more about your academic background?
Sure. So I'm originally from the United States, and that's where I did most of my studies. I got my PhD in 2017. My doctoral research focused on new forms of multilateral trade policy that came out of the First World War. And after I got my PhD, I spent 1 year at the European University Institute in Florence as a fellow before I came here to the NEC.
Could you tell us more about your research you've done for your doctoral dissertation? And how do you come to choose such a topic?
Yes. Well, I ended up deciding to focus on trade policy in particular because I found that when I was looking at economic discussions in the League of Nations in general, people always talked about trade as the nut they couldn't crack. It was something that everyone considered to be very important, but they couldn't figure out how to handle it. And that stimulated a lot of multilateral innovation and a lot of experimentation that was productive of a lot of the institutional forms that we have now. But it was also an area of policy that other historians really hadn't looked at very much because it didn't produce an immediate practical impact on the world economy in the way that cooperation in the financial sector did, for example, in relation to the gold standard or to allied debts and war reparations. So it seemed like a gap.
A gap. What is the historical context? So it's in the aftermath of the First World War, and you have this new institution established, like for fostering peace and reconstruction after the war. Where it fits this idea of migration or like movement of people in relation with free trade, and which is a bit the topic of your project here at NEC.
Yeah, so here at the NEC I'm actually developing a new project that will be my second book after I finish my dissertation book. And that project is going to look at how economic migration was addressed in international organizations, especially in the League of Nations and the early United Nations. And originally I conceptualized that project as looking at the relationship between trade policy and migration policy. And that obviously came out of my doctoral research. But over the course of my fellowship here at the NEC, I've actually shifted my focus for this new project quite a bit. So I've come to realize that migration was actually addressed in nearly every economic institution in the League of Nations. So in institutions dealing with labor, finance, transit, and trade. And there were really interesting sort of dynamic interactions between those different policy fields, and I wanted to include that in my new project. So I didn't want to just restrict myself to the links between trade and migration. So I decided to adopt a more comprehensive approach to economic migration. And that was also in response to some of the feedback I got from fellows here who were working on migration in a kind of broader perspective.
An important institutional actor for you is the International Labour Organization.
Yes.
Could you tell us more about the origin of this institution and the kind of actions or conferences or they did in order to address this issue?
So the International Labour Organization was created as part of the League of Nations system. It was affiliated with the League of Nations, but it had its own governance structure. And it was created after the First World War, largely as a response to the Russian Revolution. It was an attempt to preempt sort of revolutionary socialist impulses and provide a more moderate governmental path to social progress. And it was the primary organization that dealt with migration in the League system, and so it is the main focus of my research. And it was kind of the orchestra conductor that that managed all of the other institutions that were dealing with migration, if that makes sense. And what's interesting about the ILO is that right after the First World War, they had really big plans for migration. They wanted to turn the ILO into a kind of international labor exchange that would facilitate movement of workers between countries with what they called surplus labor and countries with deficit labor. And very quickly, because there was an economic depression right after the First World War, and also because there was very strong nationalist currents coming out of the war, national governments pushed back really hard against that idea. So the ILO ended up shifting its focus in the 1920s to refugees, and they actually became very, very involved in the resettlement of refugees in collaboration with the United Nations, or with the League of Nations Refugee Organization.
And who were the proponents of and the staff that tried to have this? Could you tell us about the actors of this ILO organization and the kind of inspiration which looked like so advanced? I mean, this idea of...
Yes. So the main proponents of an international migration policy in the ILO were the director, Albert Thomas, and also the head of the internal migration section, which was a Belgian named Louis Varlet. And those two both had deep roots in kind of pre-war social progress movements, and they had already been developing an idea of sort of labor placements based on skills and based on a kind of statistical assessment of the international labor market. And that was the idea that they wanted to implement through the ILO, and it was the idea that they actually tested out in their refugee support activities. So they did a massive census of all of the refugees in Europe and then tried to, in a very scientific way, match those refugees with skill deficits in receiving countries. And so I think probably the biggest contribution that the ILO has made to migration policy in general is to disseminate the idea of skills-based admission of migrants and of refugees. That's now a very common practice in all national migration systems, and it was an idea that the ILO promoted very aggressively in the middle decades of the 20th century.
With a certain degree of success?
It seems so, yes. I mean, that's something that that's sort of a topic for future research. As I take this project forward, I want to do more research to find out how influential ILO ideas were in national migration administration, if that makes sense. Right now I've really just been focusing on archives in Geneva and on the material, the international material, but I think to really carry this project through, I'm going to have to look at impact in different national contexts as well.
What kind of experts did they employ there? Economists probably?
Yeah, so they employed statisticians, a lot of statisticians, and economists as well. And then some of these people were, you could call them sort of career activists, if that makes sense. And Albert Thomas had actually been a civil servant in France before coming to the ILO.
Mm-hmm. You say that the problem of political refugees with shifting borders, with the end of the empires at the end of the war, this changed a lot of borders and the kind of tensions in the region. So the problem of political refugees became a thorn issue in these international discussions. In which way did they manage somehow to push the issue of migration in relation to to the refugees? I mean, this we talk about before 1930s, like in the 20s. In which way did they manage somehow to address the issue of settling refugees based on the idea of the importance of international migration?
So the League of Nations High Commissioner for Refugees shared the ILO's interest in finding employment for refugees. So he conceptualized refugee resettlement very much in terms of job placements. And so he was a very welcome collaborator for the ILO, and he was very receptive to these ideas that Thomas and Varley were developing initially in response to economic migration, but he agreed to transfer those to refugee policy as well. And I think what's interesting about the relationship between economic migrants and refugees in the League of Nations system is that refugees were sort of defined legally for the first time in the interwar period, and they were defined explicitly as migrants who weren't moving for economic reasons. So they were clearly differentiated from voluntary economic migrants, but in practice they were dealt with as economic migrants. So there's a sort of interesting tension between those two categories.
And what was the kind of reception among the governments of Central and Eastern Europe of this kind of initiatives?
They were generally very supportive because the stimulus for the League of Nations work on refugees came from the fact that refugees fleeing the Russian Revolution and the famine in Russia in the early 1920s were heavily concentrated in countries in Central and Eastern Europe that were facing pretty intense economic crises of their own. And they often were also facing a lot of sort of internal administrative and political issues because a lot of them were integrating territory from a bunch of different empires. And so they really didn't have the economic or administrative capacity to support these large volumes of refugees long term. I think the estimate is that the League of Nations estimate was that there was between 800,000 and 1 million Russian refugees in the immediate aftermath of the First World War, and that was just too many people for these states to support. So they were not very supportive of initiatives on economic migration because they saw migration as a sort of key attribute of national sovereignty, and they didn't want international organizations impinging on that, but they were very supportive of the refugee work. So I think that was one of the main reasons why refugees was an area where international organizations could have intervened fairly assertively, but not economic migration.
Listening to you, all these issues that you mentioned, refugees, economic migrants, international policies on migration, fires to me the actual present and the context. And my question is how you deal with this kind of back and forth between the present and the past. I mean, an anachronism is a danger for a historian, but still can be a kind of incentive for your historical imagination to understand what happened in the...
Yeah, I think I tend to see it as a positive thing that there are sort of strong links between what was happening then and what's happening now. And actually next year I'm going to be teaching a class on the governance of global migration, and that's going to be a kind of general social studies class, and so that's going to give me an opportunity to link up the historical research that I've been doing here with contemporary policy debates today about migration and refugees. And so I think that's something that I want to build into this project as I go forward. I don't want to shy away from those kinds of presentist links.
And how do you address the issue of the anomaly of the European Union? I mean, this political project built explicitly among free trade, the idea of free movement of labor.
Yes.
I mean,
well, what's interesting is that already in the 1920s, you start to see people in the League of Nations system saying that we think we could go a lot further in a limited regional context. We think we could do this. So there's people talking about, for example, a European passport already in the 1920s and 30s. And there's pretty high level support for this idea in the League of Nations Secretariat. So I think the idea that you could carve out a kind of regional free trade and free mobility zone develops from a fairly early stage in international organizations. But I think you are starting to see that there's a tension because you have a sort of a system of open mobility, a regional system of open mobility that is embedded within a global regime of free markets but closed borders. And so I think one of the things I'm going to look at as I carry my project forward into the 1950s is the relationship between regional and global economic structures during that early formative period.
and the issue, I suppose, of decolonization, and it's crucial for that.
Absolutely. I'm still trying to decide how far after the Second World War I want to take this project. During the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, most of the international migration debates were still fairly heavily centered on Europe. But then, of course, in the 1950s and 1960s, the geographic scope broadens a lot in response to decolonization. But I'm not sure if that might not be a topic for another project, in the sense that I think there's a lot of new factors that you have to start to take into account when you're looking at the period of decolonization.
Mm-hmm.
So I haven't decided yet whether I want to include that in this project or whether I want to just focus on the kind of European period of international governance, if that makes sense.
How was your experience being a fellow here at New York College in a multidisciplinary environment?
I found the interdisciplinary dialogue really helpful for this project in particular, because there are a lot of fellows at the NEC who are working on migration from different disciplinary perspectives, and I think they really helped me rethink the project and broaden it out, and so I found that very fruitful. And I've also really just enjoyed dialogue with people who are working on areas really widely, really far outside my own interest, people on the history of religion or the so I found it very useful.
And the experience of living in Bucharest, how was for you? I mean, is it the first time you have such a longer experience of living in Eastern Europe?
Well, I lived in Warsaw for a year, but I think I enjoyed my stay in Bucharest more. I think partly because I made a bit more of an effort while I was here to integrate, so I took Romanian classes, and I didn't do that when I was in Warsaw. That was easier because Romanian's a Romance language and Polish is a Slavic language, so it's more difficult for me. But I think that helped a lot, certainly taking Romanian.
What are your next projects? What is happening after NEC?
So I'm going to continue working on this project on economic migration, and like I said, next year I'll be teaching a class on that topic in Switzerland at the École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne, and I'll also be preparing a longer-term grant project for the Swiss National Science Foundation on this topic.
Yes. Good luck with your project, and thank you for talking.
Thank you very much.